What's up, everyone? It's the Autistic Scyther here, and this is part 2 of my essay on top 10 of my essay of all Fire Emblem characters who are autistic, whether either confirmed autistic, which many of them haven't, or autistic-coded. Part 1 is already up now, so I suggest you watch that, then come back to see part 2. Alright? Now, with all that said and done, let's move on. And before we move on, you may know that in part 1, I basically talked a little about Soren. And yeah, I basically ended up running out of time with part 1, so yeah, I might as well finish about what I was talking about with him. And when I mentioned that when he was younger, he was basically more often than not almost not, more or less nonverbal, to the point that he didn't speak until he was much older, mainly due to anxiety and nerves, which honestly most people on the spectrum, especially there are a lot of people on the spectrum who are nonverbal, whether kids or adults. What the heck? Anyway, that being said, when it comes down to the B support, one thing is simple. Well, this is basically his B support with Ike. And naturally, throughout his many supports, we basically learned what happened when Soren was a kid. Well, when Soren was younger. And in all fairness, more often than not, we see basically what happened, especially when they first met. However, in the B support, he talks about everything that happened when he was younger. Because for those that we don't know, he was basically the son of a dragon Lagoose woman, and of course King Ashnard of Dayan. And in all fairness, as soon as that happened, he was more or less given up or abandoned. Basically, eventually he was taken in by a woman who, well, basically acted as his adult mother. Well, and I say that when I really should say should have acted as his adopted mother. Not adult. Jeez, what am I talking about? Anyway, as more often than not, she was more or less complaining about him and more or less saying some pretty nasty things to him. Only when a scholar from Galia came along and took an interest in Soren and asked to take him in, the woman basically, he saw nothing more than to just not only hand him over, but to base it without a second thought in order to get a payday for it. Just yeesh. And even though that doesn't have much, this could be due to the fact that he is a branded, this basically does sound unfortunately similar to something most autistic people have gone through. Especially many parents of autistic individuals have gone through. Specifically, autistic children. As well, in all fairness, growing up, my parents, I was lucky enough to grow up with two loving parents. For many people on the autism spectrum, they're not so lucky, as especially many kids on the autistic spectrum, they're not so lucky, as most parents deal with stress related to raising their autistic kids, to the point that for some of them, it could more often than not result in, dare I say, neglect or psychological or emotional abuse, or even in some very dark cases, physical abuse. Yeesh. Yeah. Honestly, if we were in a perfect world, many people, there's a good chance that most of this is like stuff when involving parents and most of the stress involving parents and their autistic children would be basically non-existent. Unfortunately, we do not live in such a world. So, yeah, it's kind of hard to see. But honestly, it basically proves of how it proved to shape Soren into who he is now. That being said, another individual that basically most people will think will basically think of that is shaped sometimes by the autistic spectrum is the insufferable genius. Case in point, like Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory, who many people have basically said is a terrible example of the autistic spectrum. And surprisingly enough, Fire Emblem has a character that's basically their answer to Sheldon. And that character is Luthir from Fire Emblem Gaiden and Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia. Now, for most of this, one thing comes to mind. Luthir comes from a family of, skilled mages. Just him and his sister. And he prides himself as such. That being said, considering how his sister is basically a magical prodigy, at 13, I believe. Yeah, I believe that's how old Dulthea is. She's 13. But more often than not, yeah, he more or less feels like they need to live up to the example of their forebears, which really does say a lot. I mean, that being said, and as such, he more or less ends up riding Dulthea and trying to make sure that she is able to appreciate her natural gifts and use them wisely without just doing whatever she wants. And honestly, this is obviously enough that Dulthea gets a little annoyed. And honestly, in their support conversations in Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia, this is basically the case. And naturally, when it comes down to it, for most of it, he doesn't get it. And in fact, more often than not, it basically takes Dulthea to just spell it out for him. And it's especially interesting once you realizes this may be a bit of a problem. This leads us into the A support. And oh boy, is this a doozy. Because of course, we finally, as in the A support, Luthir finally makes a friend, being in this case, he makes a friend with Alm. And honestly, remember what I mentioned before when I mentioned with Luke that most people on the autism spectrum have a hard time figuring out how to make friends or how to make a romantic connection? This is basically the case with Luthier, as, oh man, he thinks that he basically asked as he basically mentions that he asked all of their friends, and he just says yes. He basically thought that him and all were good friends because he asked him if they were friends, without realizing, I mean, he's the leader of the army. Of course he's going to say that they're friends. And this, he basically has to. And more often than not, he basically doesn't realize that you have to have a good rapport with people in order to build a bond with them, in order to basically cement that friendship. And ironically, Dorothea even helps him out by basically just giving her compliments. More or less to stoke her ego, but yeah. Mostly, it's that rapport with making friends with people that most of us on the autism spectrum are just, yeah, something are unknown about. Another trope that many of us don't know about is the trope of the manic pixie dream girl, which is a trope involving a girl that is either flighty or just eccentric, who basically attaches herself to the main male character of a specific movie or book or even TV show as a sort of a somewhat romantic interest. And honestly, at this point, many people tend to not like this trope because, again, it basically infantilizes autistic women. And, well, while that one is true, there are not many characters that have done this, except for one, Ophelia from Fire Emblem Fates. Now I know what you're thinking, and here's the thing. I like Fire Emblem Fates, and I like Ophelia, no hate on her. But basically, I never realized that she may be a representative of the autism spectrum, which, well, she does basically have a love of theatrics that one would possibly consider to be her special interest that she got from her father, but in all fairness, she basically has other things that could be considered an autistic special interest that in many of her supports with the other second generation kids, she ends up showing how obsessive she can get, from basically helping Dwyer come up with a name for the tea that he serves her just because she likes how it smells and tastes. While Dwyer just is basically more or less insisting it's tea. It's just tea. To basically to her support with Forrest in protecting him from supposed threats, when more often than not they're just normal misunderstandings, like him ending up getting spice in his eye or accidentally spraying himself with perfume. And let's not forget about his supports with Ophelia's supports with old Mr. Pickles, aka Hisame. And yeah, in which she basically finds him trimming a bonsai tree that he got from an old pickling master, and once he ends up giving it to her, well, she ends up getting so obsessed with it that she calls it the spiral drastique, and gets Hisame to prune it. Huh. No? Now that I think about it, maybe she does kind of get it from Elaine. Maybe. No? This one will be continued in part 3. See you then.